Welcome everyone to this Wise Words academic seminar hosted by the Contemplative Studies Centre at the University of Melbourne. I'm Giulietta Galante, I'm Deputy Director of the Centre. First, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land on which we work, learn and live. This is for us the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples. We pay respect to elders past and present, and to any Indigenous people present today. Today we're joined by Dr. Jason Birch, Senior Research Fellow at SOAS University of London. Jason will explore the early history of Haṭhayoga, a physical form of yoga aimed at liberating practitioners from transmigration, either through transcendence or enhanced worldly abilities. He will also highlight how Haṭhayoga's integration of physical and meditative practices influenced modern gurus, and he will discuss transformation of its health benefits into spiritual goals over time. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A at any stage, and we will address them, as many of them as possible, towards the end of the session. So welcome, Jason.
Hello, and thank you, Giulietta and Kathleen, for the invitation to give a talk for Wise Words. I'm a historian of Indian religions and medical traditions, and I've been lucky enough to be involved in various research projects in Europe and the UK over the last 10 years that focus on the history of yoga. And so I look forward to sharing with you some of the results of that research. Unfortunately, much of it is unpublished because I suppose it's sitting on my desk in various forms of completion. But actually, I have a book coming out at the end of the year, and I hope several books next year that will cover a lot of what I'll talk about today. It's also actually a great pleasure to be giving this talk in the middle of the daytime, because when I participate in conferences in Europe, I tend to be up until the early hours of the morning giving papers. So I'm hoping that I'll be more coherent over the next hour during the middle of the day. Okay, so let me share my screen. All right. So I suppose I should explain the types of evidence that I'll be using to construct the history of yoga that you'll hear. The main forms of evidence are archaeology, iconography, paintings and illustrations, texts and ethnography. I suppose I should say that my area of specialty is textual study. Basically, because I'm looking at yoga traditions that haven't been studied much in the past, a lot of the evidence is textual, and much of the textual evidence remains unedited and untranslated. So I've had to spend most of my academic life working on critical editions of yoga texts and translations as well, in order to open up the field to collaborations with scholars in other areas, particularly art history, ethnography, and even archaeology. When we talk about archaeology and sculptures and so forth, we're really talking about material evidence, and this is often very important, particularly for the early history of yoga. If you open up a book on the history of yoga, you'll often see this clay seal on the left side from the Indus Valley civilization, which has been studied since the 19th century. And it was actually the British archaeologists leading a dig in Mohenjo-daro back in, I think, the late 19th, early 20th century, who found this clay seal and thought that it was a sort of deity image. Particularly, he called it a proto-Shiva type of form, and that, of course, led to people thinking that this was an early example of people practicing yoga, because the god Shiva is closely associated with many Indian yoga traditions, which feeds into the idea that yoga is a very ancient practice and has been practiced for thousands of years. I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that this is early evidence for yoga, because we really don't know who or what the deity is, whether it is a god or a human form. And our understanding of the sort of hieroglyphic type of symbols that occur on a lot of these seals is incomplete. So we don't actually know what this figure was, or what he or she was doing. I think, though, we can say from the textual evidence alone that there's solid evidence for the practice of yoga as meditation and breathing exercises from about 500 BCE, from about the time or shortly before the time of the Buddha. Also, material evidence is important for recording the practices of yoga. It tells us a lot about who was practicing in different social settings. So on the right side, you see two figures balanced on short, perhaps wooden poles. And this is on a Jain temple dated to around the 15th century in North India, or mid-India, Karnataka. And often the difficulty we have with material evidence is we lack context, usually because there's no text or explanation of an image that we might see on a temple wall. But in the case of the image on the right, we know that the context is yoga, because on the panels next to these two figures are two religious figures closely associated with the rise of physical yoga techniques at the beginning of the second millennium. So it's quite likely that the two figures we see here are members of that particular sect and are performing complex yoga postures. So this gives us an idea that even in Jain temples, the practice of yoga was of interest. And in this particular part of India, if we look at the material evidence around the 15th and 16th century, yoga was being widely practiced. We can sort of put paintings, illustrations, and text together, because in many cases, the best evidence that we have for reconstructing the history of yoga and how it was practiced was when we get images and text combined, as you see on the right side there, with a folio from a Hindi work written in the 18th century called the Yogasana Mala, where we get the practice and the system of yoga described in text, and then illustrations accompanying that, so that we can see exactly what the practitioner was supposed to be doing. Often, if we have just text, it can be difficult to work out the position of the body. And I think this is the case with any language, even for those of you who've attended a yoga class. If a teacher just stands there and tells you how to place your body, it can be difficult to know what to do if they're just saying place your right foot on the left side of your hips and your left foot on the right side. It's when they actually show you what to do, or show you an illustration, as we see here, that it becomes much easier to understand. And in the case of the image on the left, which is a mural painting on the wall of a temple in Jodhpur, Rajasthan, because some of these images also have textual descriptions written underneath them, we've been able to link them to texts that we know were written in that area around the same time, and form a more complete understanding of the types of yoga practices that yogis were doing in that particular area. Ethnography is also very important, where scholars, particularly anthropologists, have gone to India over the past decades and interviewed practitioners from various, yoga has pervaded just about all aspects of Indian society. So from religious renunciate traditions, member of whom you see here, right through to kings and nobles, we have evidence for the practice of yoga. And of course, anthropologists can interview these people and learn about what they're doing and what they think about yoga. Of course, it is limited in some respect what this evidence can offer, because it is modern, and so you can't really read what people think about yoga today in India back into what was happening even 50 or 100 years ago, because ideas and practices change over time. But it's nonetheless very valuable for furthering our understanding of what texts are saying and how they're perceived and used in modern yoga traditions. The other complication with ethnography is that the term yogi is very broadly used in India. It can refer to people who actually don't practice yoga at all. It can be more of a social designation based upon their religious affiliation or their social position. Or the term can be used for people, say, practicing asceticism, such as you see here, lying on a bed of nails, or another iconic form is standing on one leg for 12 years. And these people are called yogis, but in a lot of the yoga texts that we read, this is a form of asceticism, tapasya, which is in many cases not part of a physical yoga practice. So often the social context of ethnography can be very complicated and difficult to to align with our historical view through the material and textual evidence. So in this lecture, I'm going to focus on the rise of physical yoga techniques, which start to appear at the beginning of the second millennium in a tradition of yoga that came to be called Haṭhayoga. Hatha yoga is still used today by many yoga teachers to refer to, what's essentially a physical practice of yoga. The word hatha means force, and as I'll explain, it really refers to the forceful effect that these physical practices had on various energies, mainly the breath, within the body. And I suppose the first thing I should point out is that these physical practices follow a long history of yoga that dates back to at least 1,000 years beforehand. Again, it's the textual and material evidence that indicates this long history. And we know that around the 5th century, there was a fairly sophisticated and influential work composed called the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, or Patanjali's Yoga Shastra, if you like, yoga scripture. That's really the culmination of many centuries of development in the practice of yoga. And this text is important, and it remains important today in, around the world, anywhere where yoga is practiced, because it's set out some basic ideas that have really endured since the time it was composed. So the definition of yoga is, over the centuries, has remained unquestioned, if you like, or quite consistently used. The beginning of the text tells us that yoga is the cessation of mental activity. So here it's referring to a profound meditative state called samadhi, in which discursive and conceptual thinking basically stops. Respiration becomes very subtle, and a very sort of even ego and the basic sense of our positional consciousness, our sense of the body and so forth, dissolves. The beginning of the text also makes clear that this meditative state is an important means to achieving liberation. And liberation, which is basically freedom from suffering and the cycle of birth and death, was essentially the aim of most Indian religions and philosophies, really since the time of the Buddha. And in Patanjali's view, this profound meditative state enables the seer, or the witnessing principle within us, you might say a sort of subtle form of consciousness, to abide within itself. And this is referring really to a philosophical viewpoint where there's an essential difference between this witnessing state or witnessing principle and the world of materiality. And its conception of suffering basically revolved around the fact that when our witnessing principle identifies with the world of materiality, where things change, arise, decay, die, and so forth, that's when suffering ensues. So the aim of this yoga was to achieve a profound meditative state in which the yogi could see that this witnessing principle within him or herself was eternal and unchanging and untouched by materiality. In fact, it was sort of fundamentally separate and distinct from that. And when this realization occurs, freedom from suffering is achieved. Basically, since the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, just about all traditions of yoga have accepted that, that an important part of the practice, or even the aim of the practice itself, is the achievement of this profound state of meditation. That's, you might say, a consistent theme throughout the history. And Patanjali is also important because he established a fundamental format for the system of practice that was supposed to achieve this state of meditation. And it's called the Ashtanga system, or the Eightfold System. And it begins with behavioral guidelines such as the practice of non-violence, speaking the truth, celibacy, and so forth. It then has preliminary observances that are more specific to the practice of yoga, such as the study of scripture, or bodily and mental cleanliness, certain ascetic practices such as fasting. And then the practice of yoga per se, where we have postural practice. At this time in the 5th century, postural practice in yoga was mainly a seated position for the practice of breathing exercises and meditation. As you see in the left here, a position that such as Padmasana, where we often see Buddha depicted in, or even Indian yogis and ascetics. The complex asanas and the physical practices that I'll be talking about really arose at a later time. And at this early stage in yoga's history, it was mainly just the seated poses that are mentioned and explained. Breath control is essentially methods of holding the breath to slow and even stop mental activity. Sensory withdrawals, the idea of turning the senses within. So in our day-to-day life, we're sort of looking out and interacting with the world around us. Well, through yoga methods, we turn that perception around so that we're not focused on what's going on around us. We're focused on what's happening inside the body. Concentration is focusing the mind on one point and holding it there. Meditation is when there's a sort of a flow of consciousness on that point without the effort of holding it. And meditative absorption is Patanjali's definition of yoga, where we have this profound state of meditative, of meditation, basically, where there's no normal mental activity. But I must also say that different definitions of yoga have occurred since Patanjali's text. And this is mainly the result of different philosophical systems underlying the practice of yoga. So in many respects, it's best to view yoga and its practices of components of different Indian religions and philosophies that have arisen over the time. Patanjali is useful because he sets out a basic format for the idea of what yoga is and how it's practiced. But then changes occur as yoga is absorbed into different philosophies and religions. So when we see yoga in a monistic sort of system, where there's no fundamental difference between spirit or the witnessing principle and materiality, then the idea of yoga, and this is one of the fundamental meanings of the word itself, of union or joining two things together, tends to be the definition that we see. So in this case, in the Yoga Bija, a text that teaches some of the physical practices, we see the idea that yoga is the union of the individual's sense of self, that's positional consciousness, with the supreme self, which is a sort of the more universal form of consciousness, beyond ego, beyond individuality, and so forth. So the definitions that we see for yoga change over time as a result of different religious and philosophical movements of particular importance between Patanjali Yoga and the traditions that I'm talking about, Hatha and Raja Yoga, are some of the tantric religious movements, the Vedantic, particularly Advaita Vedantic movements, as well as changes in Brahmanical religion, such as we see in the sort of ongoing composition of Vedic material, the Upanishads, legal and social materials such as the Dharma Shastras, and even medical texts such as those of Ayurveda. So I'm going to start with the Amarauga, an early text that we know was written around the 12th century in South India, that contains a very rudimentary or basic practice of physical yoga that then grew over the centuries as more techniques and ideas were added to form this tradition we call Haṭhayoga, that in many ways culminated with a text known as the Haṭha that was composed in the 15th century. And this text, the Haṭha, which is widely used today amongst gurus and yoga teachers, basically established a paradigm for the practice of physical yoga that started in a very rudimentary way in the Amarauga, slowly developed, and then when it was codified by the Haṭha, it became the standard and was widely accepted after that time. And it's really after the 15th century that a lot of the literature that we have was composed, and that's why I call the period Haṭhayoga's floruit or Haṭhayoga's flourishing, because it's at that time that we start to see these physical practices really spreading out and moving into different religions and philosophies and becoming part of the mainstream idea of what yoga is. So the Amarauga defines Hatha yoga, which contains these physical practices, as being accomplished by the breath and internal resonance. So in terms of breath practice, it's mainly, as we'll see, the holding of the breath and lengthening the exhalation. And the internal resonance refers to the sound that the body naturally makes itself. We're often not aware of it, but if you were, for instance, to cover your ears with your hands, close your eyes and listen within, you will hear a very sort of subtle sound of your body. The idea is that through the practice of yoga, these sounds are magnified to the point where you can use them as an object of meditation, focus your mind on them, and then become absorbed in them. And as we'll see in this text, it's a meditative practice where you sort of start with particularly coarse sounds, and as the meditation practice advances, the sounds become subtler and subtler. The physical practice called Hatha, involves 3 seals. These are called mudras. Seal is a literal translation of the word mudra in Sanskrit. They're basically, you might say, 3 postural positions that involve internal muscular locks that seal the breath within the body and manipulate the movement of the breath internally in different ways. So that's perhaps inspired the use of the word mudra for these practices. And what's also important in the Amarauga is that it's very clear that these physical practices called Hatha are supposed to lead to Raja Yoga, and Raja Yoga, which literally means the sovereign yoga or the best of all yogas, the king of all yogas, is defined clearly as freedom from mental activity, the same definition of yoga as we saw in Patanjali Yoga. So Raja Yoga here is really just a synonym for what Patanjali called the absence of mental activity, which is really that state, profound meditative state, more generally known in Indian literature as samadhi. So the 3 seals have the following names: the Great Seal, the Great Lock, and the Great Piercing, Mahamudra, Mahabandha, and Mahaveda, and they're practiced as a sequence, as I'll show you. The first practice, Mahamudra, starts in this position with one leg straight and the other leg bent at the knee, and the heel of the bent leg is pressing against the perineum. That's the part of the body between the anus and genitals. And then the yogi leans forward, holds the foot of the extended leg, takes the breath in, holds breath, and applies what's called the chin lock, which is where he presses his chin down, as you can see here, onto the top of the chest, or the nape of the neck, if you like. So you can immediately see that, unlike earlier traditions of yoga, this is not the standard upright seated position. Here the yogi's bent forward and is flexing the spine in modern anatomical terminology. So this practice is is done with one breath. So the yogi assumes the position, breathes in through the mouth, applies the chin lock, holds the breath, and the practice is supposed to push the breath internally down to the base of the spine. And the spine was seen as a very important part of the yogic body because it contains the central channel. And the idea in these systems of yoga was to unblock the central channel, which is usually blocked at the base, and then to move the breath into the central channel. And it's when the breath is eventually forced up into the head that this state of Raja Yoga, where there's no mental activity, no sort of normal thinking, can be achieved, and samadhi ensues. So this first seal is the very beginning of moving the breath where it would normally be in the chest and the abdomen down to the very base of the spine. The second mudra, called Mahabandha, the great lock, is often practiced in this seated position. So from having the one leg extended, he bends that at the knee and places the foot of the extended leg on the opposite thigh. So he's in a cross-legged, the yogi's in a cross-legged position at this point. So this diagram is just showing us the position of the legs. He would then breathe in, and the main difference internally between the great seal and the great lock is that when he breathes in through the mouth, holds the breath, he then applies not only the chin lock, but also the root lock, and that starts to force the breath into the central channel. The third method can be done either in the cross-legged position that we saw, or this in the Haṭhayoga, it's more of a squatting position, or a position where the legs are in a sort of symmetrical, if you like. But the idea either way, regardless of how the legs are positioned, is that it's basically a breath retention with a tapping movement, and the yogi's supposed to place the hands on the ground, lift the torso up and down, and tap the perineum against in this position against both heels, or in the cross-legged position, as you see here on the right, against the heel that's underneath the torso. So I can show you a demonstration of how this might have been done. Okay, so it starts with the breath in through the mouth, then the chin lock, and the breath is held. The texts don't tell us how long the breath was held, but they do often say that one should hold according to one's capacity. For this particular practice, I mean, there are other breathing exercises where the length of the retention is specified. Then from that position, one moves to the cross-legged position, takes another breath in through the mouth, applies the chin lock, and then the real distinction here is the root lock, gripping the perineal area at the base of the lower, at the base of the spine, draws the abdomen and starts to push the breath, according to yogic thinking, up through the central channel. So that's the second breath. And then the third breath, breathing in, and then applying the chin lock, and then tapping the perineal region against the heel. And this is supposed to force the breath further up through the central channel As I'll mention in a minute, the reason that this was thought to be necessary is because there are various blockages within the central channel. And then one's supposed to do the other side. So one starts with, in that case, with the right leg extended, and then on the second side, one has the opposite leg, in this case, the left leg extended. So one round, I would say, would consist of 3 breaths on each side, total of 6 breaths. And according to the Haṭhayoga, it's supposed to be practiced every 3 hours around the clock. So 8 times, 8 sessions a day. So that's the chin lock. This is Maha Bandha, chin lock with the root lock. And then Maha piercing. Mahaveda, the reason it's called the great piercing is because the breath is supposed to be pushed so forcefully up through the central channel with this tapping motion that it pierces the blockages that would otherwise stop the breath from moving up. And one would do that for as long as one can hold the breath comfortably. So the aims of this practice can be summarized as follows. These 3 physical practices were supposed to open the central channel, which is normally blocked for the average non-practicing person. It's blocked at the base by a serpent energy called Kundalini that has a sort of serpent form, and her mouth is over the opening of this central channel. And it's through the practice of yoga that she is aroused and awakened, and then takes her mouth off the central channel so that one can then start to move the breath into it. And then it's supposed to clear the blockages in the channel and move the breath up. So this is really the essence of the practice, because there are 3 blockages, one at the navel, one at the throat, and one between the eyebrows. And if the breath remains stuck at the base, then Raja Yoga is not achieved. Basically, it seems the idea was that when the breath is in the central channel and it's moving up into the head, then the meditative state ensues. As the breath is slowly moving up and breaking through the blockages, different forms of bliss, meditative voids, and internal sounds arise. So when it's at the base and it's trying to break through the blockage in the abdomen, fairly what you might say gross forms or normal forms of bliss, meditation, and coarse sounds like kettle drums and the sounds of waves of the ocean crashing on the beach are arising for the yogi. But then as the breath moves up more to the chest and then up towards the beyond the middle of the brow, the bliss becomes more subtle, the meditative voids more profound, and the internal sounds are subtler. So we move from things like kettle drums and waves crashing on the beach to musical instruments like flutes and lutes and so forth. So this is this is a translation of verses towards the end of the section on Haṭhayoga in the Haṭhayoga, when the yogi has moved through this sequence of blisses, voids, and sounds to reach the point where he or she is about to achieve Raja Yoga, is about to achieve this meditative state that then enables liberation. And it says, the flute-like sound, so this is one of the more advanced, he's in an advanced stage, one of the more advanced sounds, becomes the sound of a resonating lute. Then the mind, having become one with the sound, is called Raja Yoga. The yogi becomes a creator and destroyer and equal to Shiva. So this is basically, the last statement is basically saying that liberation is at hand. He's sort of achieved, he's attained all the yogic powers. He's in dualistic Shiva systems, the idea wasn't necessarily to merge with the absolute, it was to become an equal to Shiva. And that's what's being expressed here. But in a non-dual system, it would be to become one with Shiva, and that would of course mean or ultimately imply that one is free from suffering, free from the process of birth and death, that was really the ultimate goal of these systems of yoga. And I might also say that the appeal of physical practice and many earlier traditions was that they made the claim not only for liberation, but also liberation while alive. So some of the mainstream forms of religion in India, particularly the Vedic Brahmanical forms, involved the practice of ritual or even study that one would have to do throughout one's entire life. And then it's only at death that liberation could occur. One reason I think that yoga and other systems of philosophy and religion became more appealing was that they made the claim that they were much more effective if they were practiced properly in achieving liberation very quickly, so much so that you could be liberated while still alive. And in the physical yoga traditions, that also involved the claim of immortality, that in fact you would never fully die as the average person would. You could continue to live in a very subtle, refined, eternal, unchanging body. And I think this has a lot to do with a changing conception of the body from earlier religious traditions, where the body was seen as a source of suffering, an obstacle to liberation, where liberation was ultimately about transcending the material world, to a shift to a more sort of body positive viewpoint that accompanies these physical yoga traditions, where the body is more of a mechanism for liberation and a mechanism for living in the world untouched by disease, old age, and death. So this state of Raja Yoga, this meditative state, is discussed in other texts that teach the physical practices written at around the time or just after the Haṭhayoga, and give us a sort of a fuller picture or different perspectives on the goal. The Yoga Taravali is one such example. It says in this verse, having removed everything, beginning with the states of I and mine, in other words, the ego, those whose minds are steady in the glorious state of Raja Yoga are not observers nor objects to be observed. Only pure awareness prevails. So this is talking about the transcendence of the sort of normal experience of duality, where we see ourselves as separate to the world around us and to other people in it, to a state where we start to see the oneness of everything, the very fact that what we perceive to be boundaries between us and the other are no longer there. And in this, again, Raja Yoga is likened to a meditative state, and in it only pure awareness prevails. It then says, when one's ego has disappeared, then one's body... this moving on to the Yoga Bija, another text which takes a more philosophical approach to explaining why Raja Yoga is a necessary means or a necessary or sufficient cause for liberation. It makes the point that when one's ego has disappeared, then one's body has also disappeared. What more can be said of one's diseases? As there can be no effect at any time without a cause, how can there be suffering in the body without an ego? So here we start to see, with this more body positive view of the world, that transcending suffering would come about with this sort of different state of consciousness, where the body is not perceived as being separate to one's awareness or perception. And but nonetheless, the body endures because it basically becomes the state, in the parlance of Vedantic philosophy, of Brahma, which is this underlying principle of unity, just as salt becomes water. So in other words, when this state of unity is perceived, then the material body dissolves into it like salt becomes water, and they become indistinguishable. When it becomes identical to Brahma, then that is the defining feature of one who is liberated. Okay, so after the time of the Haṭhayoga, various texts such as the Yoga Bija and the Yoga Taravali were composed, different ideas, more physical practices were added, and eventually the Hatha Pradipika was written, which sort of set forth a blueprint for the practice of physical yoga and the attainment of samadhi. So the Hatha Pradipika changed the format slightly by introducing physical postures called asanas, different types of breath retentions. It retained the bodily seals, the mudras that we saw, but added others. So it expanded the basic set of 3 that we see in the Haṭhayoga to a set of 10. And then, as it says, the fusion of the mind with the internal resonance. So that meditative system of the sounds that was explained in the Haṭhayoga is retained in the Hatha Pradipika, and in some ways it's elaborated upon. There becomes a set of 10 different sounds and various techniques such as putting cotton in the ears and so forth for facilitating meditation on them. So these 4 factors, asana, breath retention, bodily seals, and the infusion of the mind with the body's internal resonance, according to the Hatha Pradipika, is the sequence of practice in Hatha. So with the practice of posture, we start to see the incorporation of what I call non-seated postures. So as I mentioned with Patanjali's yoga and many early traditions, the only postures that we see mentioned in texts are those that are suitable for meditation and breathing exercises. It's with the development of Hatha Yoga that we start to get some very strenuous asanas, even dynamic asanas, being incorporated into the practice. And as I'll argue, I think that this was mainly because of the shift in the view of the body and the importance of curing illnesses in the practice, particularly of physical yoga. So one of the postures that's mentioned in the Hatha Pradipika is called the bow pose, Dhanurasana. And that's a pose where basically both legs are stretched out in front. The yogi grabs the toes and then pulls one foot to the ear sequentially, if you like, on one side and then the other side. And so some of these poses that start to be incorporated into these physical traditions are actually moving postures. And we do get some commentarial remarks that this practice should be done continually from the left side to the right side. So it would look something like this. So this is a big difference from, say, a static seated meditation pose, where most of the activity is internal in terms of meditation or visualization. Here we're starting to see, just as we did with the mudra, the 3 mudras that I discussed, we're starting to see physical movement become integral to the practice. Now, I believe that these physical practices were incorporated into yoga mainly through their healing benefits. And we do get strong indication of that in the texts, where they're often described as being able to cure illnesses and diseases. And in some cases, more specific illnesses are mentioned. So one such example from the Hatha Pradipika is a pose called Matsyendrasana, which is named after one of the founders of this physical tradition called Matsyendra. And the benefits of practicing this pose, which you see, it's a twisting position that's done on the right-hand side there. One of the benefits is that it was described as a destructive weapon for the many terrible diseases that develop in the stomach. Through the practice, it brings about the awakening of Kundalini, so it unblocks the central channel, in other words, which is important because one needs to move the breath up into the central channel. And it creates steadiness of the spine, which of course is very important for Raja Yoga, because once you have the breath moving in the central channel, then one has to sit upright and very still in that state. Interestingly enough, this is one of the poses where we see depicted on temple walls, basically because Matsyendra was a very important religious figure throughout India. And he's easy to identify because his name literally means Lord of the Fishes, Matsya. So he's often depicted sitting on a fish, and sometimes you can see him sitting on a fish in a pose that looks like Matsyendrasana. In this case, on the right side, you see he's doing it with the use of a strap around the hips to hold himself in that twisted position. So the general purpose of these complex and sometimes dynamic physical postures that we see in medieval yoga was basically it became a central practice to Haṭhayoga, which we have to remember was practiced in order to achieve Raja Yoga, this meditative state. They were said to cure various diseases. They're often said to strengthen digestion, which in the Indian way of thinking is very important for health, because digestion was seen as a process of cooking, where the foods that we eat are taken down into the stomach, are then cooked to be broken down into their nutrient fluids that are then circulated around the body. So if one has very weak digestion, the food that we're eating is not cooked properly, and so we can't be nourished. And that's usually said to be one of the major causes of diseases in the Indian traditional view. As we saw, they bring about bodily steadiness that's necessary for meditation. Some texts say they also bring about strength and fitness. This could well be for the practice of mudras. Those 3 mudras that I showed you are actually quite physically demanding if they're practiced continually, as the text, or continuously over time, as the text suggests. And as we also saw, they bring about various yogish accomplishments, such as awakening Kundalini, this goddess that's blocking the central channel at the base of the spine, and then prevents, and her that blockage is preventing meditation because the yogi can't move the breath in to the central channel. So I'll just make a quick conclusion by saying that the physical yoga techniques emerged in India at a time when the role of the body in achieving liberation from suffering was changing. The older traditional view, where the body was considered an obstacle to be conquered, such as in the case of traditional Indian asceticism, where bodily mortification was sort of undertaken so that one could develop mastery of mind over pain and discomfort and so forth. This older view was supplanted with one in which a healthy body was seen as a mechanism for achieving soteriological states of meditation and liberating knowledge. Underlying this body-positive view was the assumption that disease was an obstacle to yoga because it prevented a person from succeeding at it. This belief led to the development of physical practices that were thought to cure illnesses and achieve the requisite meditative states. In many respects, the traditions of physical yoga laid the foundation for the rise of modern postural yoga in the early 20th century. The curative effects of physical yoga techniques, as well as traditional systems of Indian medicine, played an important role in India's efforts to develop indigenous systems of healthcare that could rival, supplement, and even replace the European ones fostered by colonialism. Since India's independence and its rise to power on the world's stage, yoga has spread globally to become an almost mainstream form of exercise and alternative medicine. Its ability to adapt to many different social and political environments is in part due to its long history, in which many diverse systems and techniques of yoga have been developed and preserved for countless centuries. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason. That was really interesting. I have a lot of questions myself, and I would like to give the audience some time to prepare their questions as well. They are coming in, actually. So can I just start with this idea that you mentioned? I mean, the modern versions of Hatha Yoga and what's happening in India politically. Like, I don't, I'm not an expert by any means, but I know that the current president of India is very supportive of yoga. Is that something that is right to say, and expanding it in India itself, or what's your view on currently what's happening in India with yoga?
Yes, yes. The current government, the BJP, and Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister,
Prime Minister, sorry, yeah,
are very supportive of yoga. Narendra Modi presents himself as a practitioner, and you'll often see photos of him performing asanas in his lovely garden in the presidential grounds. And the reason for that is that he and others within his party see yoga as a very important part of Hindu national identity. And with really the global spread of yoga over the world, very much in the second half of the 20th century, they see it as an important mechanism for promoting, I suppose, Indian culture and its gift, one of its gifts to the world. So with current efforts, political efforts to promote and shape Indian identity, yoga has sort of played an important role in that. But I would also say that yoga, of course, within India, that has many different cultural settings. It still has a very strong a role within many Indian religions. It plays. It's very successful for the sort of spiritual tourist market. People from Australia, Europe, and America going to India for health retreats or meditation retreats and so forth. And it's really the culmination of both the internal domestic situation as well as the global interest within yoga that I think's resulted in the current political interest and enthusiasm for yoga.
Yeah. Okay, so I have some questions from the audience. So there are questions around, very practical questions around what to practice. For example, one is saying, how on earth do you decipher which technique or practice to follow when there are so many? Any suggestions?
Well, it's often said in the yoga text that one should learn from a teacher, and usually a teacher will belong to a particular tradition or have a particular practice themselves. And it's the traditions and the practices and even the texts themselves that explain different systems of practice and how the different techniques all fit together, how they should be practiced. And as we saw in the Haṭhayoga, the sequence of practice, the different components of it, and so forth. So it very much depends on the teacher, the tradition, and in the case of texts, that's evident as well.
Thank you. There are also the questions around contemporary yoga compared with and Western yoga compared with the traditional yoga that you have explained. So with these contemporary Western yoga practices being, according to this person, somewhat sanitized, commercialized, etc., how do you go about finding a culturally appropriate facilitator? So this links to the other questions, to your previous answer.
Yes. Well, again, the source is very important. I suppose for around issues of something that's culturally appropriate. And I suppose there are many different traditions within India itself that are flourishing today. So it's very accessible. It's accessible, both online as well as available in most countries. Many of the institutions that teach yoga are multinational, such as the one that I mentioned, the Shivananda was a guru who took a postural practice that probably dates back to the 18th century, wrote a book about it in the 1930s. And then because he was part of an institution that became globalized, the Divine Life Society, that system of practice was disseminated all around the world. And if you were in Australia, America, Europe, or so forth, you could go to a Shivananda center and learn that style of yoga and practice. Today, yoga's sort of becoming more disconnected from India in many respects. So there's something that scholars often refer to as globalized yoga, where you can go to a gym or a health center and learn a practice of yoga that's not directly connected to an Indian tradition. You know, Shivananda, it might come from a practice that was promoted by Shivananda, but his name and the Indian name of the postures and so forth may not be mentioned by the teacher. And of course, there's also a very different dialogue around the practice of yoga that's formed over the decades, where we've tried to adapt and modify the practice to suit our needs. So there's more talk around stress and relaxation, the sort of scientific dialogue of anatomy and the way the body works, physiology and so forth, that you wouldn't necessarily get in a traditional text or from a traditional teaching. And this is the way I suppose yoga has evolved globally, and that's really accelerated, I would say, in the last 20 years, where this thing that people were calling transnational yoga, where say the Shivananda Center has spread all around the world, and you can get Shivananda yoga in in lots of different countries, has now sort of moved more to just a yoga, an amorphous type of yoga that's not particularly culturally distinguished or distinct, not even really connected to India itself these days. So, but yes, but this is part of the great diversity that exists, I'd say, around the practice of yoga today.
Which, yeah, there are more questions coming in that point to this idea that there are different types of yoga, and whether, for example, in modern Haṭhayoga, the overall the eight limbs of yoga from Patanjali, that whether they should be taught or not, like, you know, what should be done in different yoga settings. And my impression for what you're saying is that yoga is already very diverse, and it has been very diverse even within the India itself. Even within India, people have used it in different ways, for even at the same time having different variations of it for different purposes. So do you see the modern versions and the Western versions, what you're explaining, even these ones that have no link with India or Indian traditions, do you see them as part of that evolution, long-term evolution and long-term diversity that yoga has been characterized by? Or do you see this as a fundamentally different shift, a new thing that wasn't happening before in India?
Well, yes, it is fundamentally new, I suppose, because it's happening on a global scale, whereas of course the pre-modern history of yoga, even up till the late 19th century, the history of yoga is pretty much confined to South Asia. So yoga techniques do move from India to other parts of South Asia and even to China and so forth. So that, yes, I suppose there was movement beyond India, but what we're seeing today is unprecedented in terms of its spread. And also, of course, yoga is being synthesized with many different disciplines, different health modalities, different forms of different views of the body that are associated with alternative healing systems, other forms of exercise, martial arts and so forth that are coming, and some of them, like Pilates, are very modern. So in that sense, it's all very new. But I would also say that there are themes of consistency or continuity, if you like. Many of the techniques and the names of the techniques have endured, for hundreds of years. Some of the fundamental ideas underlying yoga, like, for example, that the heat caused by practicing yoga can purify the body and the mind, which is an idea that that's been promoted or you might say maybe even exploited by this type of yoga called Haṭhayoga, where you practice the yoga postures in a heated room, and the practitioners sweat profusely and so forth, is sort of based on that idea of purification through heat. So there are some old ideas and old practices that have endured and made their way into lots of different social environments. What I think we see change dramatically is the discourse around yoga, how those techniques are understood, why they're practiced to some extent, even though, again, there's continuity there, that the healing benefits of particularly the physical practices has sort of endured. But then the way we understand those healing benefits today is quite different. We're more and more trying to use science to verify the healing benefits. And that started in India in the early 20th century. Some of the gurus, such as Swami Kulvalayananda, set up laboratories with scientific equipment that was prevalent at the time, that could read the rate of respiration, the pulse and so forth, and then would do yoga recording and measuring the effects that it had on the physiology, and then publishing their results in various journals. That, of course, goes back to the early 20th century, and it's still around today, where various yoga techniques are being sort of tested clinically or scientifically to try and understand their benefits. So yeah, so I sort of see lines of continuity and then lines of discontinuity. It's makes the history all the more interesting.
Yeah. Here's a question I also had, which is, for example, you've been showing pictures today. They are all about men, and I should say young men. And when you go to a yoga class today, many of the people who are practicing are women, and also the age is not necessarily young. So what do you think, what is the sort of this breakthrough in terms of, the presence of women, and how is this change being viewed from your academic standpoint?
Yes, it's a question that I get a lot, and it's a very good question, because one of the changes, I think, has been the change in demographic, and that's part of the global spread. And it's not only a change in gender, so to speak, with perhaps the majority of practitioners today being female. It's also, of course, changes in different cultures. Yoga's moving into different cultures, different countries, and so forth. Different types of people, in a sense, are practicing it. The body of someone from India is very different to someone from Japan. It's very different from someone from America, and yet we're all, in a sense, trying to practice many of the same techniques. So I think that's causing some interesting changes in the way yoga is practiced and understood. It sort of does adjust and modify from one cultural setting to another. And the change in demographics is very interesting. So people do often ask me whether women practiced yoga in pre-modern times. And we do have some indications that they did, or that it was allowed in certain circumstances that we see, for example, in one text, the Hatha Paddhati, that amongst a list of practitioners that the yoga would be suitable for, women are mentioned. And we also get some references to women practicing a particular yoga technique called Vajroli Mudra in the 15th century in the Hatha Pradipika that I mentioned, that text that was very influential. And there, a yogini, a female yoga practitioner, is explicitly mentioned. But the references are rather scarce, and it's clear that that men are mentioned more often than not in the text, though that is a little bit misleading. Even though the language is masculine and it's referring to men, often in Indian literature, there was no sort of basically the male pronoun was used to refer to everybody in cases where both men and women were being mentioned. So often the fact that these texts are addressing a male audience in themselves doesn't necessarily mean that only men were practicing yoga. But a lot of the artistic representations that we have, as was mentioned by the person asking the question, are of men. So again, artists took the view that the iconic practitioner was a male, often a male renunciate. So we do have some evidence that kings and nobles and others, lay people, were practicing, and texts do mention in some cases lay people specifically for particular systems of yoga. But it seems the iconic form was the male renouncer, and that probably explains why on temple walls and murals and in illustrated texts we see renunciate practitioners. They were considered to be the professionals. One other thing I'd say just about women practicing yoga in medieval India is it probably depended very much on her social status and her family. Generally, a woman was very dependent on the support of her husband in what she could and couldn't do. So if the husband was practicing yoga and was very happy for her to practice, then it would have been possible for her to learn and find a guru and so forth. But if she was in an environment where yoga wasn't being practiced and the husband particularly or her family didn't care for it or want her to learn, then it would have been very, very difficult, I would say, for her to find a teacher and learn the practice. So there would have been some social restrictions around a woman practicing yoga in that regard. Yes, and today the fact that so many women practice it, I think, ties into the way yoga was disseminated in the early 20th century, Europe, America, and Australia. It was very much, it had a very receptive audience to the types of exercises and sort of self-care methods that were popular with women in the early 20th century, such as harmonial gymnastics and so forth. So yoga sort of fitted in very well with that and obviously spread quickly amongst women practicing that type of thing. And I think even today yoga is sort of seen as being perhaps not as maybe not as appealing to the sort of ideas around masculinity, building strength and fitness as lifting weights and cardiovascular exercise, though it does nonetheless seem to be accepted as an effective way of stretching and mental health in the terms of releasing stress and learning meditation and so forth. I think more and more men are trying yoga for those reasons, but nonetheless, in a yoga class today, I think it's clear that the majority of practitioners are women, and this was confirmed by the RMIT study that was done on yoga in Australia, I think in around 2004 and so forth. They found that the demographic was mainly women.
Yeah. So I noticed that you are very open to the different forms of yoga. You have mentioned even during the talk that yoga was some sort of system that could be attachable to traditions or to different religious or philosophical traditions in India and elsewhere now. So do you still hold that view that so this is related to the question of what's genuine in yoga, right? What's fake or what's commercialized and misappropriated, and what's genuine? But I have the feeling that you're not being critical of these new uses of yoga where it's all about health and well-being or about stretching, compared to what perhaps can be or used to be in other settings where it's all about awakening Kundalini and directing the breath into the central channel. I mean, all of these things they may bring health, but in very, very different ways, and some of them are being viewed as much more superficial, right? Or even like just better for losing weight for your wedding or things like that.
Yes. Well, I think one of the benefits of studying the history of yoga is that one does see beyond a particular tradition or perspective and see that yoga has been incorporated just about by all religions within India and at all levels of society. And then you can sort of start to see how it changed in these different environments, how it was discussed differently, incorporated for different reasons and with different practices. So it gives you a bird's eye view that prevents one from defining yoga in a very narrow way, that then puts you in a position of saying, well, most of what we see out there just isn't yoga, or, you know, an essentialist point of view where you might define yoga so narrowly that most of what people are calling yoga just doesn't fit that particular definition. But then I think it also, the study of the history also enables one to not only see beyond a particular tradition, but to sort of navigate one's way through traditions, to sort of see yoga, the world of yoga from that perspective as well, to see the benefits of practicing within a tradition. You know, the way that you know, if one sticks with a particular teaching and has a particular teacher, that you can progress and then be guided by the tradition in a very often a very supportive and specific way. So I think it's helpful for enabling people to navigate the multiplicity that they see around them, and then it also helps them to understand perhaps a particular type of yoga that they that they happen to find beneficial or happen to be practicing. Yes, and I think, you know, most of the academic discourse around yoga today is fairly non-judgmental that way in terms of different systems and types of yoga. I suppose that's because academics play a more observational role as when we study something, and sort of suspend judgment about what is and what isn't the thing that they're studying until they maybe start to form you know, broader parameters around it.
Yeah, so yoga would be more of a popular word, like a word that has survived. Certainly the word has survived all of these changes, the word yoga itself. But it's mostly when it makes the most sense is when it's within a certain context, right? So, you know,
that's right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And that's important. I mean, that's the case for the word yoga, even within Indian literature, that it can have many meanings. And in some academics have argued, the word itself is just a sort of empty signifier. It's only when it's within a context that you can clearly see what it is, and so it's when you become aware of that and understand the different contexts that you can then understand why a tradition is saying what it's saying and why they have a particular view and a particular practice. That's where the history can be very helpful. And then when you see yoga in a very different setting, say yoga in downtown New York in a health fitness studio where there's no mention of the tradition or Sanskrit, or but some of the practices are still being taught there, then of course you can see that a different language, different ideas and different ambitions are driving you know, the spread of yoga in that particular environment.
Yeah. Well, this is a great point to just draw this to a close. Thank you, Jason, for your presentation, and to your audience for joining us. And please subscribe to our newsletter to stay informed about what we are organizing, all the events hosted by the Contemplative Studies Center. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Bye, Jason. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.